park, actually on a park bench, talking about what type of company did we want to build, right? And the conversation wasn't focused on the product or the customer or customer acquisition techniques. Rather, it was focused on what would be the conditions under which we could actually build not only a successful business, but one that we'd all be proud of and be excited to work at. And I do think that if you can do those two things, if you can actually create a culture where those conditions hold, where you can be successful and also have a great culture where people want to come and where they can really be their best, that ultimately is going to be a major strategic advantage and becomes actually a talent flywheel that over time can be incredibly powerful. When I look out across the set of now very scaled companies that I really respect, almost all of them have very, very strong cultures, and they're different, right? Amazon's culture is very different from Netflix culture. Those cultures are very different from LinkedIn's culture, but all of them, if you talk to people who worked there early on, or frankly, if you talk to people who work there today, they can distill down what their workplace culture is, their collective personality, use Jeff Weiner's term for it, and talk about what that imparts in terms of how they do their work, what values or what behaviors are rewarded, and also what behaviors are not tolerated. In VOUCH'S case, we have 5 core values, and our first value is actually put people first. And that really goes to the heart of what I want to talk about, which is, I think if you can get the people culture right, and if you can really make your company an attractive place for great talent to come, that will really help you in your journey. Team building is not just about hiring. It is amazing to me how many people I've talked to, how many entrepreneurs, particularly first-time entrepreneurs, when you talk about team building, they really just want to talk about, well, what are the tactics for finding and hiring good talent? Now, I don't want to dismiss that, right? Because finding talent is hard. Getting people to come and join your business is hard. It's a really crucial piece, but it's not the only piece. Once you find those people and convince them to join, you also have to onboard them. You have to make sure they understand how you do things. You have to set them up for success. You have to make sure that they sit in an organizational construct with a set of business processes that will actually allows them to harness their talents and get stuff done inside of your environment. Beyond that, people want to be developed. And this is true whether someone is fresh out of college or 20 years into their career or more. I think it is only human for ambitious people to constantly want to improve. And if you look at the major reasons that people go and work at startups, that desire for development, that desire for learning is actually one of the most frequent reasons people go to startups. And so if you can actually create an environment where you're developing and motivating your people, deploying them appropriately and harnessing their talents, that creates, again, a talent flywheel. It's a virtuous cycle. Part of that is managing performance, right? If you tolerate underperformance, not only will business hurt, but actually your best performers will be demotivated. I've seen this again and again and again. Being hard on performance is not just about pushing people to be their best. It's actually about making sure that the highest performers are really attracted to your culture. Now, there's obviously, going too far on this, right? You need to have reasonable expectations, and you don't want to be in effect, whipping up your folks. You want to make sure you're creating an environment where people, you can retain people and they feel like, they can lead their lives outside of work in the right way. But if you don't create conditions to have a high performance culture, it's going to really impair your success. Engaging and retaining your people, crucially important, right? Around this, there are critical issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think this is rightly of increasing focus and prominence within the Valley, and frankly, all across businesses in the United States. This is something where, again, if you can create the conditions where a broad diversity of talent wants to be in your company and actually allow them to be successful, encourages them to be successful, you'll drive much better outcomes, and your ability to have your choice of talent will also increase meaningfully. So over the course of the rest of this presentation, I'm going to try to go into a bit more detail in each of these areas. So first off, on the actual attracting and recruiting talent, I think of recruiting as a process. I think of recruiting actually in a lot of ways similarly to how I think about sales, right? Which is you want to constantly be canvassing the market, understanding where there are opportunities. You want to have a clear framework for thinking about what you need on your team, how you evaluate that talent, and ultimately, how do you develop a process where you're attracting people, adequately evaluating them, and also getting them excited about joining you. One book that I recommend in this particular area is a book called Who. It really shifted how I thought about hiring. And just to paraphrase one of the major lessons of Who, it's that most people, when they first go to interview, actually really just kind of do it randomly. They ask the kind of questions that they had been asked earlier in their career. It's very haphazard. It's not organized. It's not structured. And the researchers have found that actually the most reliable approaches to recruiting people look more like airplane checklists than anything else. Meaning, you want to have a checklist of all of the different attributes you're looking for a specific role, and you want to make sure that you are gathering information about a candidate that's comprehensive of those, so that when you go to make a decision, when you go to either say, this person, we want to make an offer to this person or not, you have a complete information set in doing that. It's worth a read, expands very much on that point. So again, worth the time. Beyond just the hiring piece though, you also have to be thoughtful about what is your employee brand, right? People think a lot about what's our customer brand, right? What does Vouch mean to a startup who might buy insurance from Vouch? But that's not the only part of Vouch's brand that matters. We also think a lot about, well, what does Vouch mean for someone who might come and join the team? What is the talent brand we are trying to develop so that people know that, if they come and work here, what will they get out of it, right? Not to be crude about it, but it's, will I develop? Will I have economic opportunity? Will I have the opportunity to progress in my career? What are the interesting challenges that we're facing that a smart, ambitious person would want to actually be focused on? I think this is true across the talent board. I think it's especially true for technical talent, right? Software engineers, engineers of all sorts, analytics people that I've worked with, they really want to feel good about the types of technical challenges they're taking on. And they want to work on teams with other really strong technologists, people who are talented from whom they can learn. So thinking about how you can actually create an employee brand, again, a critical piece of this. And I would also say tactically, really important to think about, well, who's going to manage this talent acquisition process, right? One takeaway that I've seen over and over again, and I've made the mistake myself, is oftentimes people wait too long before they bring on a people lead, their head of people, and they also wait too long before they bring on someone to focus on talent acquisition. And we're really lucky at Vouch. We've got a great person leading people for us, and on that person's team, we have right now one, but soon to be two, great people focused on talent acquisition. And that is just such an important engine in our growth. Again, one that I would strongly encourage. So you found someone you want to hire, you've extended an offer, and you've convinced them to join. What next? I really do think that the onboarding process is something that is worth investing in. In my prior company, we underinvested on it. And what we found is if you actually tracked employee satisfaction, the first 30 to 45 days, people were excited, right? It's brand new. And then there was a lull. And it wasn't until they really kind of got clicked in and felt like their efforts were really driving success that their actual motivation and their happiness within the culture or within the company started going back up. And so there and now at Vouch, one thing we've tried to be very thoughtful about is how do we actually deliver an excellent onboarding experience? Now, I do think the approach you want to take in onboarding is very different from what you might do in a very large company, right? In a very large company, maybe you fly people out for 2 weeks of training and some socializing and people get to know each other. Obviously, this is all in pre-COVID times. During COVID, it's a bit trickier, of course. But I think in a startup, you don't have the time to do that, and you also don't have batches of employees that are large enough where it merits doing all this training and kind of onboarding all up front. And so instead, what we do at Vouch and what I've seen work really well is make sure that people have structured onboarding, but do it around the normal schedule of them actually getting clicked into their job. We always make sure that in someone's first week, they're getting onboarded by their manager. They're spending time with at least one other member of the leadership team, that they have an onboarding buddy, someone from a different function at a similar level who can kind of talk to them about just how things work. Basically, how do you get things done if they need tactical help as well. There's obviously IT and systems onboarding, and there's HR onboarding, which they do with our HR team. But then over the course of the next month, sometimes up to 6 weeks, we also have a structured onboarding program that we do with cohorts of new joiners. I actually did this month's version of this yesterday. We had 6 new joiners who've joined over the last 5 weeks or so. And I spent an hour with them talking about the company's history, our strategy, our values, and our culture. And my counterparts on the rest of VOUCH'S leadership team similarly do hour-long talks, and they are very interactive, covering their components of the business. So my co-founder who oversees go-to-market goes deep on partnerships and sales. Our chief product officer, or someone on that person's team, will go very deep on our product strategy, and so on. And as a result, 6 weeks in, someone not only has started doing their work and they kind of know where the bathrooms are, so to speak, but they also have a deep foundation in why VOUCH is doing what it's doing, what values we actually have, what that actually means in terms of how we do work. All right, so you've hired someone, you've onboarded them, now what do you do with them? There obviously are a bunch of different parameters around this that are important. Again, I go back to this point that one of the most important reasons, or most kind of relevant reasons people join startups, is because they want to develop quickly. And that's been my personal anecdotal experience, but there are studies that back this up as well. And so you want to make sure that you have the right structures in place so that you can actually develop people and also make sure that they're deployed effectively. And by deployed, what I mean in that is really organizational structure and business process design, right? I think particularly in a business like VOUCH, frankly, in my experience, most businesses, everyone has their kind of functional role, but then there are a bunch of projects and teams they're part of. And so making sure people are in the right teams and where there's real clarity around what their role is and where you're giving them license to have impact, it's really important, right? You can't ask everyone to go over to every meeting, right? That's, you become very bureaucratic and slow down. But if you just, limit all the decision-making to 3 people at the top, that's very disempowering and things will slow down. And so from an organizational design perspective, we've tried to be thoughtful about how do you get that balance right between, giving people a lot of rope to run with, while also making sure that there's clarity around decision-making, there's clarity around what the strategy is, and we're not trying to take on too much. And one tactic that we found to work really well is this notion of creating SWAT teams, or some companies might call them tiger teams, where you actually get a cross-functional group of people together around a specific problem or opportunity and empower that team to drive results in the business. So for example, today we have one team focused on growth. We have another focused on success and servicing, meaning basically after we acquire a client or bring our client on board. We have a team that is focused on platform, and we have a team that's focused on kind of people and culture. And what we found is those teams actually, again, can drive a lot of impact, and it gives people opportunities to flex beyond kind of the narrow role that they have. And those teams, of course, evolve as the business's strategy and as the business's needs themselves evolve. From a training and feedback perspective, I mentioned before what we do upfront. I really do think you want to overinvest in onboarding and obviously some role-specific and function-specific training. But then beyond that, you want to make sure that people are getting the mentorship necessary to succeed. I believe this is both formal and informal. If you just rely on formal performance evaluation, which in our case we do every 6 months, some companies might only do it once a year, you're missing out on a huge opportunity to develop your people. And when I think about critical managerial responsibilities, myself included, one of our major jobs is developing the people around us. And so that's something I specifically look for in people managers, and especially people kind of director and above, people who are going to be overseeing and building substantial teams. Something I hold my executive team accountable for is not only how are they finding and onboarding talent, but how are they developing that talent? How are they making sure that people actually feel like they're progressing and have an opportunity to learn? And I found that piece is really powerful, not only in terms of driving performance, but also driving employee retention. And if you obviously don't retain your people, that creates a lot of churn and can actually become a real strategic issue for a business. Looks like we got one question. Like I said, I want to try to answer these along the way. So Linda's question is, please describe the hiring panel activities. For example, is there one-on-one meetings with prospective team members, say over lunch? Do these people have veto power? So first, let me describe how we do decision rights on hiring. At the end of the day, for any role we open, we very explicitly have one person who is the hiring manager. And that is the person, in most cases, 90% of the cases, that the new role we're hiring it'll be that person's boss. And the reason I'm very focused on that is ultimately the hiring manager needs to make the call because they are going to live with consequences, right? They need to be excited about the person they're bringing on the team. And similarly, if things don't work out, they need to be on the hook for dealing with that. So I am not in the mindset of let anyone veto anyone, nor am I in the mindset to let any one person make a decision without input from everybody else. So the way we design our panels is there are at least 5 people who will interview any new candidate we bring on board. Typically for more senior roles, anyone who's managing other people, it'll be more than that. And we design an overall evaluation process that includes values-based behavioral interview questions, actual, kind of case studies or tests that actually mimic the work itself. And then also some interviews that are more focused on understanding the candidate's motivations and making sure that they are excited about, the opportunity that we would put in front of them at Vouch. I typically, always for any manager or above, I will be one of the last interviews, and I focus a lot on motivation and values. I assume that by the time a candidate has gotten to me, they've already been screened for, do they actually have the functional skills necessary to be successful? And for certain roles that would report to me or that I'd be working with closely, I'll probably be even more involved in the interview and evaluation process, just so I'm really close to the data and just so I have an opinion when we actually go to make the decision. In other pieces on the panel design point, I always make sure that that panel is cross-functional. One mistake I've made, and I certainly have seen, is, let's say marketing team has decided they want to hire a new marketing associate. They staff the interview panel with the chief marketing officer, the director of marketing, and 3 other people on the marketing team. Maybe 2 other people on the marketing team and 1 person from the HR team. Well, what happens to that marketing associate's actually going to be working really closely with the partnerships team? Or maybe they're working really closely with the product management team, the customer product management team. Shouldn't that function have the ability to weigh in on that process? And also, isn't it important for that candidate to know who their most important stakeholders are going to be? They're kind of internal customers coming in. And so, answering my own rhetorical question, I believe it is really important. And so we try to design the interview panel such that there is a diversity by level, by function, and that it always includes some of the most important stakeholders for any role that we're hiring. Because again, it's about how do we make things work cross-functionally, not just how do we let a function self-replicate in isolation of how it actually needs to show up across the rest of the business. In normal times, absolutely a lunch or a meal or a drink in certain cases would be part of that, just so there's some socialization. I found that's really important, honestly, with getting candidates bought in and excited. It's harder to do with COVID, and so we've had to adapt this. And so we do kind of virtual lunches instead, which aren't as good, but they do serve a purpose and are better than nothing. So hired, onboarded, deployed, performance management. One of my mistakes early on as a leader, not just as a people manager, but actually as a leader and executive, is I was too soft on performance issues. I like anyone I hire almost definitionally, I want to see them succeed. And so I was too slow in dealing with underperformance or values-based performance issues when they started to occur. And what I found was when I corrected that problem, not only did it make my life a heck of a lot easier and the business started working a lot better, but it actually had really positive knock-on effects vis-a-vis the other people in the company. And it should be obvious, right? But the reality is if you have a team of people, several of whom are underperforming and the rest of the people are having to then pick up the weight, it's very demotivating. That underperformance is very demotivating. And so for multiple reasons, I think directly assessing and dealing with underperformance or behaviors that are inconsistent with your company's values, doing that as soon as possible, as soon as you have an inkling that there's an issue, is better. Now, it's better for a couple of reasons. One of which is you actually give the person with whom you're having an issue an opportunity to fix the behavior or remedy the skill gap. You also set the tone with the rest of the team that you care a lot about creating a values-aligned, performance-oriented culture. And again, I think it has to be both, right? If you create the softest, nicest, warmest culture in the world, but your company stinks, you're going to go out of business and that culture will go away. Similarly, if you are really hard driving and only care about the business, but your culture stinks, your people are going to go away. And at some point that's going to catch up with you, and it's going to make it much harder to actually run the business. So I think it needs to be both. In terms of how that actually manifests, it's something that I actively ask people who report to me. How are folks on your team doing? Who's doing well? Who are you worried about? Right? When I hear that there are actual issues in the business, I try to understand why did those issues happen. Not because I want to point fingers, but just because I want to understand how is my organization actually working, and are there patterns of underperformance that we need to deal with. I don't punish people for making mistakes. I want to encourage people to actually be proactive in sharing when mistakes happen. But if there's a situation where all of the mistakes are always around one person, well, that's when you actually have to go in and take some action on that. And it could be it's the wrong person, it could be perhaps it's the wrong seat, it could be the expectations haven't been set properly. My experience has been as a hiring manager, as a leader in a high growth business. We're growing headcount right now at Vouch, for example, 100% year over year or more. You will make hiring mistakes about 20% of the time. And that's just the reality. You can be almost perfect in your process, and still sometimes you're going to hire people who may be very great people, great backgrounds, but just not quite the right fit, either from a skills perspective or a values perspective. And I'm a big believer that when that happens, that is as much on you as it is on them. And so the conversation is not, oh, Miss Person or Mr. Person, you are not doing a good job. Bye. It's hey, this isn't working out. And that's as much on me as on you. So let's talk about what we can do about this from here, right? Do you want to be here? Do you want to do this role? If yes, here are the expectations. Do you think you can do that? Okay. Give them a month, see if they actually can step up. Or, hey, we're noticing that you do this behavior a lot and it's having some really negative unintended consequences, or perhaps unintended. We'll give you the benefit of the doubt. How do you think about perhaps, not doing that? We need you to stop doing that, and see if you can actually get them to shift the behavior or change the performance trajectory. But at the end of the day, if after a month or two, you're not seeing that performance lift, you have to figure out a way to make a change. Sometimes that might mean a reassignment internally, right? As you get bigger, it's more possible to do that. But early on, usually it means that you have to get that person out of the door. And again, my encouragement is, as comfortable as it may be, make sure you do it as quickly as you know that is the right thing to do. In certain situations, there absolutely are important legal protections that employees have, team members have. If there's ever any question, I would strongly encourage someone to talk to an employment attorney. We have an amazing employment attorney at Vouch. She's actually the same person I worked with in my prior company. She's excellent at her job and very efficient at helping us filter situations when there are performance issues around how do we need to handle them. And so again, one for folks to be mindful of. I would also say that thinking about performance is different when you're talking about individual contributors versus managers versus leaders. And my expectations for someone in a leadership position, someone particularly playing a visible leadership role, right, an executive role, frankly, anyone who's going to be managing managers is different from someone who is, deeper in the organization and whose kind of behavior has less kind of lateral impact than someone kind of further up in the hierarchy. Again, I don't want to be overly hierarchical in any organization I run, but I do believe that leadership matters. And I believe that, unfortunately, good and bad, leaders have more impact than folks who are in non-leadership roles. What I found, and again, there's a lot of kind of group behavioral psychology and, kind of business sociology around this, but there are, in kind of assessing leadership performance, there's obviously strengths and capabilities, but there are also underlying motives. And what I found is actually it's when the underlying motives are at odds with other leaders' underlying motives or with your company's underlying motives, that's where things can oftentimes be disconnected. And so one technique or framework that we've used, and there are a set of groups that do this assessment work, is what's called SDI Strengths Finders, to basically assess where a leader falls on different focuses around people, performance, and process. So I tend to over-index on performance and process. So one compensating mechanism is I have to think a lot about how are my people doing, right? And it's not, I consider myself an empathetic person. I can tell when I've upset someone. But if you throw me into a business context, I'm going to want to talk mostly about performance and process. Now, that means that it's really valuable for me to have people on my executive team who over-index to people, because they are going to help me address that blind spot and make sure, again, we are creating the kind of environment where people are really happy and motivated. Similarly, if you were someone who gravitated more to people or process, but not to performance, well, gosh, guess what? You got to have someone on the leadership team who's very performance oriented, because otherwise you're probably not going to drive the results you need to drive. So that's not to say that any one of these should overwhelm the others. It's really about balance. And so thinking about motivational diversity and also diversity of strengths within your leadership group is critically important, because if you overbalance to any one of these three things, you ultimately will not be able to drive the organizational performance that is ultimately necessary to win. Engage and retain. So this is kind of the last part of the cycle that I laid out at the beginning. Again, I tend to operate with a perspective that high-performing people want to be part of high-performing teams. And so if you can actually create a highly successful company, one that performs, one that drives forward, one that's ambitious, one that innovates, that actually does create a virtuous flywheel over time. Now, I do think it's important to not take that for granted. And I've certainly seen moments where, and I've seen this in companies I've led, where I think things are going great, but where there's pockets of discontent within your organization. And I think that's particularly true as your organization starts to get a little bit bigger, right? VOUCH'S today 60 people. When I left my prior company, my kind of span of care was about 330 people. And I can tell you, 330 people, I wasn't able to interact with most of those people most weeks. And so as a result, there definitely can be corners of a company or corners of an organization where you just don't really know what's going on. So I found tactics like using pulse surveys, tactics like using some mix of both in-person AMA, Ask Me Anything type Q&A, but also anonymous Q&A with some regular basis, actually allows you to surface where there are perhaps hotspots or areas of discontent. And what I found is oftentimes it's thematic. Oftentimes it's most parts of the company are working great, but the people on team X are really unhappy. And that source of unhappiness could be they feel like their work's not valued. It could be there's a bad manager and you got to make a manager swap. It could be they're just getting jammed right now because they are the bottleneck on a major initiative. And so just because a team is feeling stressed and unhappy isn't necessarily a, throw your arms in the air and give up. It's a, let's get in there and figure out what's actually going on and how do we make sure that it's not the same team or pocket of people who are unhappy on an extended basis, because that's ultimately where, feelings of unfairness can start to crop up, and ultimately those who are discontented will leave, and that again can be a major hindrance to performance. I mentioned the outset that diversity, equity, and inclusion is critically important. And I say that for two reasons, right? And I've tried to think about this a lot. The first is kind of an ethical and moral reason, right? I am of the belief that we live in a society that is, imperfect, and there is inequality, and there are lots of forms of inequality. And one of the roles of a leader is to think about the societal construct that they're in and try to make it better. I just deeply believe that as a person. I would also argue instrumentally, as a business leader, even if the only thing you cared about was business performance, you should still care about diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it'll mean that you actually can draw from a broader set of talent, and you probably will get to better business decisions, because all of the studies I've read demonstrate that cognitive diversity, diversity of team, actually is really powerful in driving better decision making. So for both of those two reasons, this is something I talk a lot about with my leadership team. And we have specific tactics we use for creating a culture that will attract a diverse array of talent, honors people's kind of their individuals, right? Whatever, identities that they have, and make sure we are inclusive in how we create and shape our culture over time. So those folks are really excited to be here and feel like they can have real impact in the organization. And again, I think if those two conditions hold true, that will allow you to not only, build a great business, but also source from the broadest possible pool of talent. And given it's so hard to find great people, I think it's just the right thing to do. Tactically, I think there are some things you can do to help with this. right? At some point in scale, almost every organization I've seen will have one or more employee resource group focused on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. In addition to that, I actually think it's really helpful to have a culture team, right? And that culture team is really more around just how do you create a great social culture within an organization? How do you do things to make sure you're living up to your values-driven culture, and that the company is actually acting and people are actually acting in the way that you want them to. Beyond those, on the engagement and retention point, I mentioned before how important it is to make sure you're proactively developing people. I also think it's really helpful to have mechanisms for helping people understand what the development pathway in your organization can be, and making sure that you're regularly checking in with them around what their goals are and how that actually maps up to where they are in the company. And then last but certainly not least, again, you will lose some of your talent over time. Part of that is just because life happens, right? Team members, spouses get jobs on the other side of the country, or a family member gets sick and they got to go take care of them. It's part of life. And so knowing that even if you manage incredibly well, you're still going to probably lose 15 to 25% of your people, once you have any level of scale, is just a natural expectation, and you need to manage your business so that you're constantly backfilling people. That's just a reality you need to deal with as a startup leader as well. So a few closing thoughts here, and then happy to answer any questions. Start by saying that in my experience, many founders, I think wrongly, reject people stuff as unnecessary bureaucracy. I would argue the actual opposite, which is people stuff is one of the most important jobs of any business leader, and certainly it's an important job of a CEO of a venture-backed startup. I really think that if you can figure out a strong kind of values-driven culture, have that tie to your talent acquisition, retention, development strategy, you can create a really powerful employee brand, which actually, again, then becomes a flywheel in the company's future success. On an organizational front, I think that hiring people onto your team who can help you with people is really valuable. Our head of people at Vouch was one of our first 10 hires. He was someone I worked with in my prior company as well. Deep amount of trust, a huge amount of respect for him, and he's done a terrific job with us. Similarly, I think that you can find, as soon as you start really ramping your team, you don't want to do it prematurely. When you really start ramping your team, getting someone in to help on talent acquisition, really, really valuable. Because again, it's a capability you need to build out. As a leader, a mindset that I think it's important to internalize is one of your most important jobs is defining the culture and shaping the team. And that's both in terms of bringing great people new onto the team, but also making changes in organizational design and in role, certainly at certain times getting people off the bus so that, again, the team matches up to the opportunity set that you have in front of you, and also so that you can continue living that values-based culture that you want to have. And then my last thought would be start with the basics. I covered a lot just in an hour, and I am not the world's expert on any one of these topics, right? I'm just a practitioner. There are deep, areas of expertise and experts around each of the major components I just walked through. And I really believe you have to crawl, walk, and then run as your company gets bigger, more successful, frankly, more complex. And if you can start with the basics and then evolve from there, that's a very powerful thing to do. I do think that there are certain things you probably don't want to change that much in the course of building a company. I think that if you can get them set up thoughtfully at the outset, you don't want to evolve your values very much. That can feel very, disconcerting for people on the team. I'd also say something like a leveling framework. You should be able to put in place a leveling framework pretty early on in a company's life cycle and then not have it evolve that much. There are other things that are going to change a ton. Your objectives will change a ton. The key results you use will change a ton. Your org design will change probably every 6 months. That's been my experience. Your reporting lines as part of that will change. How you do reviews will change. How you think about titling, how you think about total reward, including cash comp and equity and all the things you do. Those things will change. Feedback mechanisms, how you actually make sure, again, you're driving performance and developing your people, those things will evolve as well. So I try to sort all decisions into kind of long-term permanent decisions versus things that you just need to go with something and then evolve it as the organization's needs evolve. And I would say, certainly would say the same here. And then lastly, a couple of texts that have really shaped my perspective on these things, and you all can read, I think, faster than I can talk. but I'll leave this slide up here just in case folks want to pursue any of these. I'm a big believer that reading makes you a better leader, and it just allows you to learn from others, both successes and their mistakes. And so trying to make sure I'm doing a good mix of reading even as I do my day job has been really useful for me. So with that, that's really it in terms of the slides, and I'm going to turn to the questions here that are coming up, on the chat. So first question I think I haven't answered is, any comments on recruiting, particularly in a competitive environment? So I spoke a bit to how I think about recruiting as a process. I have lots of thoughts on recruiting, and embedded in this question is the point that we are in a very competitive talent market. That's absolutely true. What we've seen at Vouch is, kind of April, May, June, things were a little bit less crazy. Obviously some big tech companies have done layoffs. I think a lot of other people, because of COVID, were, slow to add to their team. But beginning basically end of summer and through today, we're seeing the talent market move as quickly as I've ever seen. And so what does that mean? What does that mean as an entrepreneur? Well, number one, it means that you have to really focus on recruiting, and it is a big part of your job. Number two, at a certain point in scale, you will need to build a capability around talent acquisition, sourcing, list development, how you actually bring people on, who's actually managing the processes around the interview panel, right? There's real work there. And so having someone dedicated on the team thinking about it is really useful. Thirdly, making sure you are attractive from a talent perspective. It goes back to these questions of, what is your talent brand? Why would someone choose to come and work with and for you when they could go do something else? And if you don't have a really compelling answer to that question, you're probably not going to win, to be quite honest. So you've got to have a crisp articulation of that, what it actually means to someone, not just financially, but like, what are they going to get out of it holistically? What type of team are they joining? How are they going to, will this actually be a formative experience for them? And I think over investing in that piece can be important, or can be really powerful, I should say. It's not easy. So I don't think that there is any silver bullet on recruiting. I think just like any other strategic capability you're building in a startup, it's something you just need to invest in, and you need to keep iterating until it starts working. Can we get the slides somewhere? Short answer there is I might have to redact a few things just because there are a couple of more sensitive details I put in here on Vouch, but in general, I'm very comfortable sharing the slides. So maybe Denise and I can coordinate on that. We can figure out how to get these to people. Utah asks, what is the best way to terminate a person that is not performing to one's expectation? My experience of this is it depends a bit. And two threshold questions. One is, does the person themselves know and recognize that they are underperforming, or will it actually be a surprise to them? And what I've unfortunately seen is, even in instances where you've given very direct feedback to someone over a period of time, they may still not have gotten it clear in their head that they're not performing to expectations. So you have to have a view of, is this person going to be surprised when I go to have this hard conversation with them or not? Secondly, I always script out any termination conversation that I've done. It's a tactic that I learned, long ago when I was first managing people and having to do these things. And I really do think crystallizing what you're going to say before you say it is really useful. Thirdly, be thoughtful of the legal implications of employee termination. Having some record of the conversations you've had with someone, demonstrating you've given the opportunity to improve, really important. If the person is in a protected class, there are legal implications you need to be thoughtful of. And so again, this is an area where it's really useful to have a employment counsel on, in your Rolodex. We would talk to our employment counsel for any major termination we would do. And then lastly, when you actually go to have the conversation, my advice is be concise, be empathetic, and be direct. So the way I fire someone is simply as to say, Mr. or Ms. Person, really sorry to say this, but today's your last day. The reason it's your last day is there's been this, period of underperformance, which we've talked about in the past. And unfortunately, we need to make a change. This person from HR can answer any questions for you. And I'd be happy to spend more time with you giving additional feedback, because again, I only wish you the best in your career. Do you have any questions? And that's it. And what I found is getting the point quickly, being concise and being empathetic goes a long way. You're not trying to give them a laundry list explanation, nor are you trying to, create a condition where they don't know what's going on, when they're not sure what your intent is. Edward asks, I agree people leadership is a secondary priority for founders. What would you say is the best argument to convince them to make it a primary priority? I mean, really simple. You can only win at scale with a good team. So if you don't actually focus on people, you will never be able to do that. I do not know of any successful startup leaders who get to any level of scale who themselves have not chosen to take this on, or who have not hired someone who can think deeply about this. You know, some founders really do just want to be focused on product and customers. From my perspective, that's fine, right? You can build a really successful company doing that, but you need to have the self-awareness that there's this whole other thing that's crucial that someone needs to do. And so, you know, oftentimes what a founder will do is, you know, you hire in a COO to deal with a lot of this stuff, or you'll have a co-founder who perhaps gravitates more to these issues, kind of play that people leadership role, the visible people leadership role, making sure that these issues are actually being addressed in how you build the company. But you can't just ignore it. Perfect. I think that's it. I don't see any other questions. We've got a few minutes left, so not sure if there's anything else on folks' mind.
Anything else for Sam? No? All right. Well, thank you so much, Sam. That was like such a phenomenal presentation. And of course, let's sync up after and see how we could get these slides to the folks that attended today. And thank you so much to Hopkins and Carley. This event would not have been possible without them, so we appreciate your partnership. And want to encourage everybody to join us at every monthly event in our Startup and Venture Capital Club series. The next one will be on January 21st, and we will talk about the rules of engagement, what every startup needs to know about labor laws and compliance, kind of an add-on to what Sam was speaking to today. So thank you so much, Sam, for your time. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much for everybody who joined us today. And so have a great rest of the day, and hope to see you again next month. Stay safe.
Great to be with you all. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.